20 dangerous depression jobs that faded into history. All right, during the tough times that swept across America in the early 1900s, men toiled in jobs that today would make most of us wince. Their daily grind was brutal, their risks unthinkable. And the 20 roles that we're about to remember are a testament to grit and perseverance. Let's take a step back into a world where hard work, danger, and old school know-how defined entire generations. And then we'll move forward to appreciate where we stand now. Number 20, radium dial painters. Radium dial painters emerged in the early 1900s when the nascent watch industry sought a way to make timepieces visible in the dark. Now, during a period when industrial safety regulations were still in their infancy, young women, often hired for their delicate, precise brushwork, applied radium-based paint to watch faces and instrument dials. Now, this job became more common as Americans embraced consumer goods, even as the Great Depression took hold. These workers were encouraged to keep the bristles of their brushes sharp by licking them. Radium, though then considered a miracle substance, was radioactive. The women were never told the severity of the health risks. As radium emitted alpha particles, over time it would weaken bones and ravage tissue. Many of the workers developed severe jaw necrosis, known as radium jaw, and ultimately suffered agonizing illnesses. By the late 30s, when lawsuits and public outrage spread, safety measures began appearing. Eventually, the radium dial painting profession vanished, replaced by safer phosphorescent materials and automated processes. Hey, look, the lasting impact was clear. Early industrial America learned a hard lesson about occupational health. The memory of radium dial painters signaled the start of a more stringent safety standard. No small comfort to those who had already paid the price. Number 19, breaker boys in coal mines. Breaker boys were often children or very young men who labored in coal mining operations, especially in places like Pennsylvania. Their job? Sorting lumps of coal by hand, separating slate and other impurities before the product hit the market. With the Depression tightening belts, families desperately needed extra income. Sending boys to the breaker was a grim necessity. These youngsters sat on wooden benches for hours in dusty, poorly ventilated facilities. Coal dust filled their lungs, causing chronic respiratory problems. Without modern safety gear, the air they breathed day after day etched black scars into their developing bodies. Accidents were common: crushed fingers, broken limbs, permanent scars. In an era before child labor laws gained muscle, this was a daily reality. As reforms rolled in and mechanized conveyor belts and sorting machines replaced human hands, the breaker boy role faded. And by mid-century, stringent child labor laws and improved technology made this line of work a painful memory rather than a source of livelihood. Their experience helped shape a future where children belonged in school, not in a coal breaker. Number 18, ice cutters on frozen lakes. Before modern refrigeration, ice was harvested from frozen lakes, then packed into insulated warehouses and shipped to homes and businesses. It was a thriving winter industry in places like New England. During the Depression era, strong men braved bitter winds to cut large blocks of ice using hand saws. Working on a frozen surface that was barely thick enough to hold their weight, they balanced with primitive tools. Slip-ups? Well, potentially fatal, as a misstep could send a worker plunging into frigid waters, with heavy clothes dragging him down. Frostbite, hypothermia, and broken limbs from sliding tools were commonplace hazards. With no modern waterproof gear, these men worked grueling hours, fueled by hot coffee and grit. As mechanical refrigeration expanded into every household, the ice delivery trade dwindled. By the mid-20th century, the idea of risking life and limb on a frozen lake for a block of ice, well, it was obsolete. Hopefully, you'll find it helpful to know that the old ice trade is a prime example of how technology made life not only more convenient, but a whole lot safer. Hey, grabbing ice from your freezer sure beats fishing it out of a lake. Number 17, powder monkeys in mining operations. Deep in the bowels of mines, long before modern blasting regulations, there were men known as powder monkeys. During the Great Depression, with employment opportunities pretty slim, some ventured into the hazardous world of underground mining. Powder monkeys handled dynamite and other explosives, materials that could blow at the slightest mishandling. Imagine lighting fuses in dimly lit shafts where a single spark could turn you into a statistic. Air thick with dust, unreliable fuse lengths, and an absence of proper ear and eye protection meant that these jobs were literally ticking time bombs. When a charge misfired, workers scrambled to find cover. Sometimes they made it, sometimes they didn't. As technology advanced, drilling machines became safer, explosives more stable, and remote detonation techniques replaced manual fuel lighting. Over time, stricter safety codes emerged, turning the powder monkey into an artifact of an era when danger was just part of the job description. Number 16, lumberjacks using hand tools. Logging in the 1900s, especially during the Depression, was a brutal line of work. Men hacked through old-growth forests, swinging massive axes and pulling cross-cut saws with sheer brute strength. Without modern chainsaws, harnesses, helmets, or steel-toed boots, these lumberjacks faced instant peril with each swing. Timber fell unpredictably. One misjudged angle, and a trunk could crash onto a worker, leading to devastating injuries or death. Now, on top of that, moving these logs required horsepower, or in the early days, just manpower. Workers strained muscles and broke bones, handling enormous timber. Winters were unforgiving, and summers brought swarms of insects and disease. But America needed lumber, and these men delivered. Over time, gasoline-powered chainsaws, tractors, and mechanized harvesters replaced the raw labor and risk. The iconic image of a man with an axe, though romanticized, belongs to a harsher past. Number 15, early steel mill workers at the blast furnaces. Steel built modern America, skyscrapers, bridges, railroads, but producing steel in early blast furnaces was a job that tested human endurance. In the era of the Great Depression, men stoked fiery furnaces that roared with unimaginable heat. No advanced ventilators, no modern cooling suits, just sweat, grit, and the constant threat of molten metal splattering like lava. Burns, heat exhaustion, and chronic lung disease were as common as calloused hands. The environment was deafening, and the safety guards were minimal. Falling into a vat of molten metal was a worst-case scenario, but severe burns, hot-falling slag, and toxic fumes were daily concerns. As improvements in the furnace design, automation, safety standards, and protective gear took hold, many of these direct hands-on roles were replaced with controlled operations from safer vantage points. While steel production is still intense, the image of a bare-chested man feeding fiery dragons in the mill is mostly history. Number 14, a telegraph lineman on high wires. Before modern communication towers and reliable safety harnesses, telegraph linemen scaled wooden poles and precarious scaffolding to string miles of cable. Throughout the Depression, as America struggled to stay connected, these men ventured into rural frontiers. They had little more than spiked boots and simple belts to hold them in place. They faced wind gusts, lightning storms, and the constant risk of electrocution. Falling from a 40-foot pole or being struck by a snapped cable was no joke. The lack of standardized protective gear meant every climb was a test of luck and skill. As telegraph lines gave way to telephone lines and eventually wireless communication, improved climbing equipment, bucket trucks, and rigid safety codes transformed the job. The perilous balancing act of early linemen faded with time, replaced by regulated procedures and more advanced materials that protect today's workers. Number 13, diver operators in crude diving bells. Imagine diving in the early 1900s, descending beneath murky waters in a primitive suit attached to a hand-pumped air hose. Depression-era salvagers and maritime construction workers, well, they did just that. Using heavy copper helmets and weighted boots, they ventured into harbor wrecks, underwater construction sites, and riverbeds. Any kink in the air hose, any faulty seal, and a diver could suffocate instantly. Visibility was minimal, communication rudimentary, and decompression sickness, or the bends, was poorly understood and often fatal. Without modern decompression chambers, a diver who surfaced too quickly could suffer agonizing injuries. Eventually, improved dive suits, regulated air supplies, and better training methods all arrived, transforming underwater work into a safer endeavor. By the mid-20th century, the old crude diving bell operators and their life-threatening routines became a historical footnote in the story of maritime progress. Number 12, Gandy dancers on the railroads. Now, railroads connected America, fueling commerce and travel, but building and maintaining those tracks during the Depression required teams of Gandy dancers, the men who aligned rails and pounded spikes by hand. Armed with sledgehammers, lining bars, and sweat-soaked bandanas, they worked under blazing suns and freezing winds, often for meager wages. Now, without mechanical aids, backbreaking labor was constant, and loose gravel could give way, causing falls or twisted ankles. Sharp rail edges led to nasty cuts, and the rhythmic swinging of hammers, if out of sync, could injure a coworker. Over time, mechanized equipment replaced much of the manual toil. By the end of the mid-century, automated spiking machines, hydraulic track adjusters, and improved safety protocols rendered the Gandy dancer a romanticized figure in American folklore rather than a real profession. Number 11, whalers harvesting oil on the high seas. Whaling peaked before the Great Depression, but the industry still clung on in some corners until modernization took hold. Men sailed for months, facing storms, scurvy, and the primal fury of wounded whales. Now, hunting these massive creatures with harpoons and hand-thrown lances, they risked being dragged overboard, capsized by a thrashing whale tail, or impaled by a giant beast fighting for its life. Processing the whale blubber on deck was dangerous too. Slippery surfaces, open fires in tripods, and the constant threat of infection from cuts in an era before antibiotics. Now, with the advent of petroleum and vegetable oils, along with international whaling restrictions, the whalers' trade faded into a bygone narrative. By the mid-1900s, modern fuels and public sentiment had relegated the horrors and hardships of whaling to a distant and salty memory. Number 10. Matchstick makers and phosphorus exposure. Now, before safety matches were common, factory workers dipped match heads into white phosphorus, a toxic chemical. The Great Depression meant that any job was better than none, and matchstick makers toiled in poorly ventilated rooms, inhaling deadly fumes. The result? Well, a painful disease called phossy jaw, where the jawbone decayed, causing horrific disfigurement and immense pain. Early regulatory efforts were slow and a bit inconsistent, leaving many workers ill before proper reform could take place. Eventually, the use of white phosphorus was banned, and safer alternatives like red phosphorus or other non-toxic compounds became the standard. Over time, improved chemical regulations and mechanized matchmaking equipment eliminated the need for human hands to handle dangerous materials, ending the era of the phosphorus poison matchstick maker. Number 9. Oil rig roughnecks without modern safety. Early oil rigs were rickety structures, cobbled together to tap into the wealth beneath the ground. Depression-era roughnecks lacked modern drilling technology, dealing with temperamental machinery, sudden blowouts, and deadly fires. Oil-coated surfaces were also slippery, and workers often balanced on narrow beams high above the drilling floor. With little protective gear, falls and crush injuries were common. Now, stray sparks could ignite oil and gas, which would lead to a catastrophic explosion. The roar of the drill bit, the stench of crude, and the constant risk of being struck by swinging cables made every shift a gamble. As extraction methods improved, stronger derricks, blowout preventers, and enforced safety regulations emerged. By mid-century, while oil drilling did remain tough, the bloodiest chapters had begun to close. Roughnecks today operate with protective gear, better training, and technology that would have astounded the Depression-era predecessors. Number 8. Tannery workers exposed to noxious chemicals. Before modern environmental regulations, tanneries ran on harsh chemicals, chromium salts, lime, and acids that stripped and treated animal hides. In the Depression era, tanners worked in cramped conditions without proper ventilation. They inhaled fumes that corroded their lungs, handled raw hides that carried bacteria and parasites, and faced skin lesions and chemical burns daily. With no gloves, masks, or protective aprons, chemical-induced dermatitis or respiratory ailments were a given. Riverways near tanneries became polluted, and workers' health suffered. Over time, as industry standards improved, protective equipment became mandatory. Safer chemical alternatives and mechanized processes reduced direct human exposure, and by the late 20th century, most tanneries had evolved beyond their hazardous origins, leaving behind stories of workers who did pay a steep price for a paycheck. Number 7. Asbestos miners and millers. Asbestos was once celebrated as a miracle mineral. Fireproof, insulating, durable. Depression-era industries couldn't get enough. Men mined raw asbestos from underground shafts or surface pits, breathing in dust fibers that would later settle in their lungs. They milled asbestos into powders that permeated the air, clinging to skin and clothing. Silicosis and asbestos were poorly understood and even more poorly treated. Workers coughed through their shifts, not knowing their shortness of breath signaled a grim fate. Decades later, mesothelioma and lung cancer cases would soar. Eventually, strict regulations and outright bans on certain asbestos products took hold. The once thriving asbestos mining industry faded, and the men who had worked in it became tragic figures in a cautionary tale of occupational health hazards. Number 6. Lead painters in auto and shipyards. Lead-based paints were widely used before the lead's toxicity was fully appreciated. Depression-era painters in auto factories, shipyards, and construction sites applied coats of vibrant but deadly paint by hand, often spraying it without masks. Over time, they inhaled lead dust that accumulated in their bodies, causing neurological damage, anemia, and organ failure. Disturbingly, no one warned these workers about the hazards. They took pride in a job well done, painting iconic cars and ocean liners that defined an era. As research piled up, lead in paint was phased out, but by the 1970s, the U.S. banned lead paint in consumer products. sealing the fate of those old industrial painting methods. The modern painter now works with safer formulations, protective gear, and better ventilation, making the lead-laced past an unsettling memory. Number 5. Street lamplighters dealing with carbon arc lamps. Before widespread electric lighting, cities used carbon arc lamps. These produced intense light but required lamplighters to scale poles, replace carbons, and adjust filaments. During the Depression, as cities struggled to maintain infrastructure, these men worked at dizzying heights with no harnesses. They balanced on ladders or wood poles, holding fragile glass globes and hot carbon rods. Shocks from manufacturing wires, falls onto hard cobblestone streets, and burns from arcs were common risks. Rain and ice made climbs even more perilous. Eventually, electric incandescent bulbs and automated streetlights replaced the carbon arc systems. Modern streetlight maintenance workers now use hydraulic lifts, safety harnesses, and standardized tools, light years safer than the lamplighters' previous climbs of old. Number 4. Early aviation barnstormers and male pilots. Now, the age of early innovation, though more than a risky profession of a traditional job, included pilots who delivered airmail or who performed brainstorming stunts through tough economic times. Depression-era pilots fly mostly outdated biplanes with unreliable engines. Weather forecasting was rudimentary, navigating with guesswork. Crashes were frequent. If an engine sputtered mid-flight, a safe landing was a luxury, not a guarantee. Male pilots braved storms to keep communication flowing, sometimes swinging through mountain passes without radar. Barnstormers performed daredevil loops, wing walking, and parachute jumps to entertain crowds for small change. Over time, aviation regulation, improved aircraft design, and better training grounded the worst hazards. While flying remains inherently risky, the freewheeling, perilous days of early airmen belong to a bygone era. Number 3. Human computers and calculators in factories. During the Depression, some manufacturing firms and research labs employed human computers, who were people who performed repetitive calculations and measurements by hand, often handling materials that were coated in toxic chemicals or working near loud, vibration-heavy machines. The mental strain was immense, eyesight deteriorated, and repetitive strain injuries were quite common. These workers sometimes handled measuring devices that were dipped in mercury. They breathed dust from factory floors and sat hunched over tables without ergonomics considered. In time, mechanical calculators, followed by electronic computers, eliminated the need for human calculators. By mid-century, safer office environments replaced stuffy factory corners. Today, data crunchers sit behind ergonomic desks, free from the physical dangers that their Depression-era counterparts endured. Number 2. Canal diggers and dam workers without modern equipment. Massive infrastructure projects put people to work during the Depression. Think of the Hoover Dam's construction. Men dug canals, built dams, and dredged rivers with pickaxes, shovels, and crude pneumatic drills. They inhaled silica dust. They worked precariously on steep embankments and faced sudden landslides. Explosions for clearing rock were set off without robust safety protocols, putting workers at a constant risk. Heat stroke under the desert sun, hypothermia in cold rains, and collapsed trenches could cut lives short. As mechanized excavation, portable ventilation systems, and earth-moving machinery advanced, the era of men laboring entirely by brute force, it ended. Modern construction crews now rely on strict OSHA standards, heavy machinery, and protective gear, making the old manual canal diggers and dam builders a symbol of how infrastructure work has evolved. Number 1. Early cotton mill operators. Cotton mills in the early 1900s, including the Depression era, were dusty, noisy factories. Workers inhaled cotton fibers, leading to bicyanosis, a respiratory disease causing wheezing and chest tightness. Now, floors were slippery, machinery exposed. Fingers could get caught in spinning frames, leading to horrific injuries. Child labor also was not uncommon, adding to the tragedy. Now, without hearing protection, the constant clatter of looms led to premature hearing loss. As technology improved and labor law stiffened, cotton mills modernized. Fully enclosed machinery, better ventilation, and mechanization reduced human exposure to direct hazards. Today, textile factories bear little resemblance to the perilous cotton mills of old, symbolizing how time and technology can improve conditions for workers everywhere. Well, there you go. We visited 20 of the most dangerous, grueling, and often tragic jobs that once defined an era. They serve as a great reminder that the comforts and securities that we enjoy today were hard-won by those who came before. Their sacrifices laid the foundation for modern safety standards, regulation, and technologies that we now take for granted. I hope you find this video helpful as we dusted off the pages of American history. And if you appreciate learning more about the past, its struggles, lessons, and triumphs, be sure to hit that subscribe button and join us for more deep dives into history's turning points. Together, we'll keep the stories alive, honoring the people who made our modern lives possible.